That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day on the road became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that behind the engines and the leather, there are still human hearts. The desert wind cut through the thin fabric of Jack Harlan's jacket as he pulled his Ironhawk's bike into the gravel lot of the Last Chance Diner. It was just past dawn, the sky a bruised purple over the flat stretch of Nevada highway, and the air carried the sharp tang of sagebrush mixed with cooling engine oil. Jax killed the ignition, the rumble fading into a low hum that echoed in his chest before silence settled like dust. He swung his leg over the saddle, boots crunching on the stones, and paused to light a cigarette. The flame flickered against the chill, illuminating the faint scars on his knuckles, marks from a life he'd pieced together from fragments of regret. At 42, Jax had seen enough miles to know that mornings like this held a quiet weight, the kind that pressed on your lungs before you even stepped inside. The diner was a squat building with faded red paint and a neon sign that buzzed faintly even in daylight. Open 24/7, pies always fresh. He pushed through the door, the bell jingling softly, and the warmth hit him like a sigh, grease and coffee mingling with the faint sweetness of baking dough. A few early risers hunched over their mugs, a trucker nursing black coffee, his eyes heavy from the night shift, and an old mechanic in grease-stained overalls, staring out at the empty road. Jax slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl creaking under his weight. He wasn't here for the food. Not really. The Ironhawks had ridden in late last night, after a long haul from Reno, their annual toy run for the local kids' shelter. It was one of those traditions that kept the Brotherhood grounded, a way to balance the leather and chrome with something softer. Jax had volunteered for the Santa gig this year, white beard, red suit stuffed into his saddlebag. He'd grumbled about it at first, but deep down, it felt right, like reclaiming a piece of the man he'd buried under years of bad choices. The waitress, a woman named Lena with tired eyes and a name tag pinned crookedly to her apron, approached with a pot of coffee. "Morning, Jax? The usual?" Her voice was soft, edged with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many sunrises alone. She poured without waiting, steam rising in lazy curls. Jax nodded, watching her hands, calloused from years of carrying trays, but steady. Lena had been at the diner for over a decade, a single mom scraping by after her husband walked out. The Hawks looked out for her, slipping extra tips under plates or fixing her old Chevy when it coughed and died. As she turned to leave, the door swung open again, letting in a gust of cold air. A man entered, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a threadbare coat, towing a little girl by the hand. She couldn't have been more than 6, her dark hair tangled and her cheeks flushed from the wind. The man, mid-30s, with the hollow look of someone who'd been running on fumes, guided her to a stool at the counter. "Just coffee for me, Black," he said to Lena, his voice low and strained, like it hurt to push the words out. The girl climbed up beside him, her small boots dangling, and buried her face in her hands. Jax glanced over, his cigarette forgotten in the ashtray. The girl's shoulders shook subtly, a quiet sob muffled against her palms. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they kept to their own corners. The trucker flipped a page in his newspaper. The mechanic stared into his mug. Jax felt that familiar pull in his gut, the one that whispered of old wounds, of a daughter he'd lost touch with years ago after a custody battle that left him hollow. He stubbed out the cigarette and stood, the booth groaning in protest. Lena caught his eye as he approached the counter, her brow furrowing slightly. She slid a menu toward the man, but he waved it off. "We're just passing through," he murmured, fishing a crumpled 5 from his pocket. The girl lifted her head then, revealing red-rimmed eyes and a tear-streaked face. She clutched a worn, stuffed bear, its fur matted, and whispered something to her dad that made him wince. Jax paused a few feet away, the scent of burnt toast hanging in the air, and cleared his throat. "Everything all right here?" His voice was gravelly, not demanding, just steady. The man looked up, startled, his hand tightening on the coffee cup. Up close, Jax could see the exhaustion etched into his face. Dark circles, stubble that hadn't been shaved in days. The girl peeked at Jax from behind her fingers, her lower lip trembling. "We're fine," the man said quickly, but his eyes darted away toward the window where the first rays of sun glinted off the highway. Lena hovered nearby, wiping the counter with a rag that had seen better days. She exchanged a glance with Jax, the kind that spoke volumes without words. This wasn't the first time a father and daughter like this had wandered in, fleeing something unspoken, debts, arguments, the slow grind of a life unraveling. Jax nodded, not pushing. He turned to the girl instead, crouching slightly so he wasn't towering over her. "Hey, kiddo, that bear got a name?" Her eyes widened, surprise cutting through the tears. She hesitated, glancing at her dad, who gave a small nod. "Mr. Whiskers," she whispered, her voice small but clear, like a crack in the morning quiet. Jax smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softening. "Good name. Strong fella, looks like." The man shifted, discomfort rippling through his posture, but he didn't interrupt. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the diner's windows, and Jax straightened. He could feel the weight of the day ahead, the toy run, the kids at the shelter waiting for Santa's arrival. But something in this moment lingered, a thread pulling at the edges of his resolve. Little did he know, this chance encounter would unravel secrets that reached far beyond the diner's walls, touching lives in ways no one could have foreseen. Lena set a plate of pancakes in front of the girl without a word, a quiet gesture from her own pocket. The child stared at it, then at her dad, who managed a weak smile. Jax returned to his booth, the coffee now cold in his cup, but the air felt heavier, charged with the unspoken. The road stretched out endlessly beyond the glass, promising turns he couldn't yet see. The sun climbed higher, turning the Nevada sky from bruised to a pale, unforgiving blue, as Jax lingered over his coffee at the Last Chance diner. The black liquid had gone bitter on his tongue, mirroring the quiet unease that had settled in his chest since spotting the girl and her father. He watched them from the corner of his eye, the way the man, Tom, he'd overheard Lena call him when she refilled his cup, stirred his coffee endlessly, the spoon clinking like a metronome against the porcelain. The girl, Ellie, picked at her pancakes with a fork too big for her small hands, her earlier tears drying into faint tracks on her cheeks. Mr. Whiskers sat propped on the counter beside her, one button eye staring blankly at the ceiling. Lena moved behind the counter with the practiced grace of someone who'd turned survival into routine. Her apron was dusted with flour from the morning bake, and she hummed a fragment of an old country tune under her breath, the melody fraying at the edges like the hem of her skirt. She'd been part of this roadside world for 15 years, ever since her ex-husband's truck vanished one rainy night, leaving her with a toddler and a stack of unpaid bills. The Iron Hawks had become her unofficial family in the years since, Jax and the others rotating shifts to walk her to her car after closing, or showing up with tools when the diner's ancient fridge gave out again. It wasn't pity, it was the code, unspoken but ironclad. You look after your own, even if your own was strung together from strangers who shared the same stretch of asphalt. Jax pushed his plate aside, the uneaten eggs congealing under the fluorescent lights. He needed to get back to the motel where the Hawks were staging for the toy run. The shelter in town expected them by noon, bags of donated toys rumbling in on the backs of their bikes like a mechanical sleigh, but his boots stayed planted, rooted by the scene unfolding at the counter. Tom glanced at the clock above the register, 10:47. then down at Ellie, who had abandoned the pancakes for a slow tracing of syrup patterns on the plate. "We should hit the road soon, kiddo," he said softly, his voice carrying the faint drawl of someone from the Midwest, places where winters bit deeper than this desert chill. Ellie nodded without looking up, her fingers sticky and deliberate. Jax caught the tremor in Tom's hand as he pulled out his wallet again, revealing a thin fold of bills that looked more like IOUs than currency. The diner door swung open once more, admitting a gust of hot wind and the low rumble of another engine. It was Marcus, one of the Hawk's younger riders, his leather vest patched with the club's emblem, a hawk in mid-dive, wings spread against a stormy sky. Marcus was 28, fresh-faced under the scruff, with a prosthetic leg from his time in the sandbox overseas. He'd joined the club 2 years back, trading desert patrols for these open roads, finding in the Brotherhood a structure that the VA couldn't provide. "Mornin', Lena. Jax." Marcus nodded to them both, sliding onto a stool 2 down from Tom. His eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked to the newcomers before settling on the menu. "Coffee and whatever's quick. Got the run starting soon." Lena poured without a word, her gaze lingering on Marcus's limp as he adjusted his position. A subtle shift, barely noticeable unless you knew to look. The Hawks didn't talk much about their scars. They wore them like the ink on their arms, stories etched in silence. Jax met Marcus's gaze across the room, a silent exchange passing between them. The club had a way of reading situations, picking up on the frayed edges of desperation like the scent of overheating brakes. Tom stiffened slightly at Marcus's arrival, his posture closing in around Ellie, but he said nothing. The girl, oblivious, reached for her bear and hugged it close, whispering secrets into its ear that only she could hear. Outside, the highway shimmered in the rising heat, mirages dancing at the edges where blacktop met horizon. Jax remembered rides like this from his own past. Endless miles with a child in tow, back when his marriage was crumbling under the weight of his long hauls and her endless shifts at the factory. He'd lost custody after one too many nights away, the judge's gavel echoing like a backfiring engine. Now, at 42, those memories surfaced unbidden, ghosts in the rear view. He stood finally, tossing a 20 on the table, enough to cover the stranger's meal without fanfare, and approached the counter again. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" Jax asked Tom, his tone even, like gravel under tires. Tom hesitated, then shrugged, sliding the stool beside Ellie a fraction closer to him. Marcus watched from his spot, sipping his coffee black, the steam curling up to fog his vision momentarily. "Just passing through," Tom repeated. But there was a crack in the words this time, a weariness that begged for understanding. Ellie looked up at Jax, her eyes wide and curious. The tears from earlier replaced by a tentative spark. "You ride that big bike?" she asked, pointing toward the window where his Ironhawk gleamed under the sun. Jax nodded, crouching to her level again. "Yeah, she's a good one. Takes me places I need to go." He glanced at Tom, who was staring into his cup as if it held answers. "You two heading far?" Tom's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching under the stubble. "Far enough. Job fell through back in Ohio. Thought we'd try our luck out west." The words hung heavy, laced with the subtext of evictions and empty promises. Lena busied herself at the coffee maker, but her ears were tuned, her own history mirroring the man's in echoes. Marcus cleared his throat, breaking the tension with a casual lean. "West's full of chances if you know where to look. Shelter in town's hiring seasonal help, nothing fancy but steady." He didn't push, just offered the information like a spare tool from his kit. The diner fell into a companionable quiet, broken only by the sizzle of bacon on the grill and the distant whine of a semi accelerating down the highway. Ellie smiled faintly at Jax, her small hand patting Mr. Whiskers. "Santa comes on a bike sometimes?" she asked, the question innocent, pulling at something deep in Jax's chest. He chuckled softly, the sound low and genuine. "Sometimes he does, kiddo, especially out here." As the clock ticked toward 11, Tom gathered their things, the weight of the road pressing in again. But in that brief interlude, amid the clatter of dishes and the hum of the neon sign, a fragile thread of connection had formed, one that would soon be tested by revelations neither man could anticipate. Jax watched them head for the door, the bell jingling like a farewell, and felt the pull of the Hawk's code stirring. No one rides alone, not truly. The desert wind whispered promises of storms ahead. But for now, the diner held its breath, a sanctuary on the margins. The afternoon sun baked the asphalt outside the Last Chance diner, turning the parking lot into a shimmering haze that distorted the horizon. Jax lingered at the window, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of his coffee mug, the porcelain still warm against his skin. Tom and Ellie had stepped out minutes ago, the door's bell fading into the wind's low moan, but their silhouettes lingered in his mind, the way the girl's small hand had slipped into her father's, a fragile anchor against the vastness of the road. He exhaled slowly, the smoke from his earlier cigarette replaced by the faint bitterness of regret, and pushed away from the booth. Marcus was already settling his tab. The clink of coins on the counter, a punctuation to the morning's quiet revelations. Outside, the Ironhawk's bikes lined up like sentinels in the gravel, chrome catching the light in sharp glints. Jax straddled his, the leather seat creaking under him, and fired up the engine. The vibration thrummed through his bones, a familiar rhythm that drowned out the doubts whispering at the edges of his thoughts. Marcus pulled up beside him, visor down, his prosthetic leg adjusting with a soft click against the peg. "You good?" Marcus asked, voice muffled by the wind, but clear enough. Jax nodded once, revving the throttle. Words weren't needed. The Brotherhood spoke in the roar of engines and the steady line of riders cutting through the desert. They rode out in formation, a convoy of dust and thunder heading toward the outskirts of town, where the children's shelter squatted on a forgotten corner of the highway. The building was a low-slung affair, cinder-block walls painted a faded yellow, surrounded by chain-link fence that rattled in the breeze. Toys from the Hawk's Run, dolls, trucks, puzzles wrapped in newsprint, were strapped to the backs of their bikes, a cargo of hope amid the club's usual load of tools and tension. As they pulled into the lot, heads turned. A nurse in scrubs paused mid-step, her arms full of linens, eyes narrowing at the leather vests and the growl of idling Harleys. A volunteer, grey-haired and prim, crossed her arms by the entrance, her lips pressing into a thin line that spoke volumes of suspicion. The Hawks dismounted in silence, unloading the donations with the efficiency of men who turned mechanical precision into a way of life. Jax hefted a duffel bag over his shoulder, the weight pulling at the old ache in his back, and caught the volunteer's stare. "For the kids," he said simply, his voice low, holding her gaze until she looked away, cheeks flushing. It was a familiar dance, the judgment that painted them as outlaws, hearts as hard as the roads they rode. No one saw the hours Marcus spent in garages, fixing beat-up cars for single mums without charging a dime, or the way Jax slipped cash into the shelter's donation box after dark, anonymous as a shadow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and crayons, mingled with the faint mustiness of donated clothes. The shelter director, a woman named Rita, with laugh lines etched deep around her eyes, greeted them at the door. "You boys again," she said, her tone warm but edged with the weariness of someone who'd fought too many battles for too few resources. Rita had lost her son to the foster system years back, a story she shared only in fragments over coffee after runs. She clapped Jax on the arm, her hand lingering. "Santa suit's in the back room. Kids are buzzing, heard the rumble from a mile off. Jax changed in the cramped storage area. The red velvet hanging heavy on his frame, the fake beard itching against his stubble. He adjusted the white trim, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror. The man beneath the costume a ghost of the father he'd failed to be. His daughter, now 17, and living states away with her mother, hadn't spoken to him in years. The beard muffled his breath, turning each exhale into a labored hush, and he stepped out into the common room, where a dozen children waited, their faces a mix of excitement and guarded hope. The toy distribution began with controlled chaos, laughter bubbling up as Marcus handed out action figures, his limp forgotten in the moment. Jax ho-ho-hoed his way through the line, kneeling for the smaller ones, his knees protesting against the thin carpet. But then he saw her, Ellie perched on a plastic chair in the corner, her father standing awkwardly behind her, hat in hand. Tom's face was paler now, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool interior, and Ellie's eyes were downcast, fingers twisting the ear of Mr. Whiskers. How they'd ended up here, Jax couldn't guess, but the thread from the diner pulled taut, invisible, but insistent. He approached slowly, the bells on his suit jingling softly, and crouched before her. "Well, if it isn't the girl with the strongest bear in town," Santa, Jax, said. His voice pitched gentle, the words catching slightly in his throat. Ellie's head snapped up, recognition flickering through the surprise, and for a moment her lower lip quivered. Tom shifted, discomfort radiating from him like heat from an engine block, but he didn't intervene. The other children chattered around them, but here, in this pocket of quiet, the air thickened with unspoken need. "You made it," Jax continued, pulling a small wrapped gift from his bag, a stuffed animal, a fox with bright eyes, chosen on impulse that morning. Ellie's hands trembled as she took it, her breath hitching in a way that twisted something deep in Jax's chest. "Santa sees everything, kiddo, even the hard days." She hugged the fox close, burying her face against its fur, and Tom cleared his throat, eyes glistening under the fluorescent hum. "Thank you," he murmured, the words rough like gravel under tires. Around them the volunteer watched, her earlier suspicions softening into something like awe, the misconception of these rough men cracking just a fraction. As the afternoon wore on, the shelter filled with the soft clamor of joy, papers tearing, giggles echoing off the walls. But Jax felt the weight of eyes on them still, the town's quiet judgment lingering like dust in the air. Rita pulled him aside later, her voice low. That family. Tom's running from more than bad luck. Corporate shark back east cleaned him out, job gone overnight, CEO type, no mercy. The revelation hung there, a shadow over the moment, but Jax nodded, the Santa beard hiding the set of his jaw. Outside, engines cooled in the fading light, promising roads ahead laced with choices yet to come. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The fading light of the Nevada afternoon stretched long shadows across the shelter's parking lot, where the Iron Hawk's bikes sat like silent guardians, engines ticking as they cooled against the encroaching dusk. Jax peeled off the Santa suit in the back room, the red fabric pooling on the floor like spilled blood, leaving him in his worn jeans and the club's leather vest that hung heavy on his shoulders. His hands, still smelling faintly of the synthetic beard glue, rubbed at his jaw, the skin raw and itching. The laughter from the common room echoed faintly through the thin walls, children's voices rising and falling like distant thunder, but it couldn't drown out the knot tightening in his gut. Ellie's face, pressed against that new fox toy, lingered in his mind, her small frame a mirror to the daughter he'd lost years ago, the one whose letters had stopped coming after the divorce papers were signed. Rita lingered in the doorway as he dressed, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, the lines of exhaustion carving deeper into her face. She was in her late 50s, hair streaked with grey pulled into a practical bun, but her eyes held the steady fire of someone who'd rebuilt her life from the rubble of loss. "That man, Tom. He's not just down on his luck," she said quietly, her voice pitched low to avoid carrying. The air in the storage room was stale, laced with the scent of old cardboard boxes and donated blankets, and she leaned against a shelf, the wood creaking under her weight. "Came in last week, half frozen, with the girl in tow. Said he was an engineer back in Chicago, middle management at some tech firm. Then the layoffs hit. CEO gutted the place for profits. Pink slipped half the staff without a backward glance. Tom's wife left him after that, took what little they had. He's been drifting since. Shelters and soup kitchens all the way west." Jax paused, boot half-laced, the leather strap biting into his fingers. He knew that story too well, the corporate blade that sliced clean through lives, leaving men like Tom adrift on roads that led nowhere. His own past echoed it, a trucking job lost to automation, followed by the spiral of bar tabs and missed court dates that cost him his family. He straightened, the vest settling like armor, and met Rita's gaze. "And the CEO, anyone know the name?" His words came out even, but there was an undercurrent, a low rumble like an idling engine. Rita shook her head, a faint sigh escaping her lips. "Harrison Vale, big shot, picture in the papers, suits and smiles, donating to charities for the photo ops while folks like Tom end up here." She glanced toward the common room, where volunteers were herding the children toward dinner, the clatter of plastic trays a soft counterpoint to the tension. "Tom's got a court date coming up, custody hearing. Ex-wife's pushing to keep Ellie, says he's unstable. If he doesn't show proof of stability, a job or a home, it'll break him." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the chain-link fence and carrying the faint scent of rain on distant mountains. Jax stepped into the lot, where Marcus and a few other hawks, Rico, the club's quiet mechanic with ink-black tattoos snaking up his arms, and Lena's brother, who rode with them sporadically, were packing up the empty duffels. Their faces were shadowed under the lot's single floodlight, flickering to life as twilight deepened. Marcus caught Jax's eye, wiping grease from his hands on a rag, the fabric dark and stained. "Rough one today," he said, not asking, just stating. The Brotherhood had a way of sensing the fractures, the way a rider feels a tremor in the handlebars before the road buckles. Jax nodded, leaning against his bike, the metal still warm from the ride. "That dad and girl from the diner, they're here. Tom's name is Tom Riley, lost everything to some suit named Harrison Vale." The name hung in the air, unfamiliar yet sharp, like a shard of glass underfoot. Rico spat into the gravel, his breath visible in the cooling air. "Vale. Heard of him. Rode through Chicago last year, saw his face on billboards. Company makes software for logistics, cuts jobs with algorithms, they say." His voice was low, gravelly from years of shouting over engines, but there was no rage in it, just the quiet acknowledgement of injustice, the kind that simmered without boiling over. The group fell silent, the only sound the distant hum of highway traffic, semis barreling through the night like indifferent beasts. Jax's mind turned to Ellie, her trembling hands clutching the fox, and the pull of the code tightened in his chest. No one hurts those we protect, not while breath remained. He'd seen too many fathers like Tom, hollowed out by systems that valued balance sheets over blood. His own regrets surfaced, unbidden, the last phone call with his daughter, her voice small and accusing. "Why aren't you here, Dad?" He'd hung up then, the receiver heavy in his hand, and ridden until the dawn broke over empty plains. Marcus broke the quiet first, slinging his helmet over the handlebar. "We could look into it. Rico's got contacts back east, old army buddies in tech. It wasn't a plan, just an offer, the kind passed between riders like a shared cigarette." Jax exhaled slowly, the desert air dry against his throat, and glanced toward the shelter's lit windows, where shadows moved like ghosts. Tom and Ellie would be inside now, perhaps sharing a meal in the communal hall. The girls' laughter, if it came, fragile as new frost. As the Hawks mounted up, engines coughing to life in a staggered roar, Jax felt the tension coil tighter, a storm gathering on the horizon. The road ahead twisted not just through canyons and dust, but through choices that could shatter or mend. He revved his throttle, the vibration steadying his pulse, and pulled out first, the line of bikes following like a chain unbroken. Behind them, the shelter receded, but the weight of unspoken loyalties pressed on, heavy as the night closing in. Rain began to patter on the asphalt, soft at first, then insistent, washing the grime from the world but stirring the mud of old wounds. Jax rode on, the CEO's name echoing in his thoughts, a silent promise forming in the dark. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the Nevada highway into a slick ribbon that reflected the taillights of the Ironhawks ahead of Jax. His wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield of the club's borrowed van. Rico had insisted on it for the gear they'd loaded after the shelter run, tires humming over wet asphalt as the storm lashed the desert. Jax gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles whitening against the leather wrap, the vibration traveling up his arms like a pulse. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp leather and motor oil, mingling with the faint metallic tang of Rico's takeout coffee sloshing in the cup holder. Marcus rode shotgun, his prosthetic legs stretched out, boot tapping faintly against the dash in time with the downpour. They'd pulled off the main road 20 miles back, detouring to a roadside motel that squatted like a forgotten relic under the flickering vacancy sign. The Iron Claws, no, Hawks, had a loose network of such spots, places where riders could hole up without questions, the kind of anonymity that came with paying cash and keeping engines quiet. Jax parked under the overhang, rain drumming on the metal roof like impatient fingers, and cut the engine. The sudden silence amplified the storm's roar, water cascading from the eaves in steady curtains. Marcus exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw, the scar on his temple catching the dim light from the motel's office window. "Think Tom's still at the shelter?" Marcus asked, his voice low, not breaking the hush. He didn't look at Jax, just stared out at the blurred line of parked bikes, their chrome dulled by the rain. Jax nodded once, the motion heavy. "Rita said he'd crash there tonight. Custody hearings in 2 days. Vegas courthouse. If he misses it..." He trailed off, the words dissolving into the patter outside. The thought of Ellie, small and fierce with her toys clutched tight, twisted in his chest like a wrench on a stubborn bolt. He'd seen that look in her eyes at the shelter, the guarded hope flickering before the walls went up again. It mirrored his own daughters at that age, back when family photos still hung on fridge doors instead of gathering dust in a drawer. Rico emerged from the office then, keys jangling in his grease-stained hand, his broad frame silhouetted against the neon glow. He was the oldest of the core riders at 51, tattoos faded from sun and time, each one a chapter of regrets, prison ink from a youth spent hot-rodding stolen cars, now overlaid with the Hawk emblem like a vow. "2 rooms," he said, tossing one set to Jax. "Lena called, said Tom's truck broke down outside town. She's towing it to her cousin's garage come morning." His eyes, dark and steady, held Jax's for a beat longer, reading the unspoken. Rico had lost a brother to the streets years back, a kid caught in a gang crossfire that no code could avenge. It made him the listener, the one who pieced silences into plans. Inside the room the air was stale, laced with the faint mildew of past floods and the sharp bite of industrial cleaner. Jax dropped his duffel on the sagging bed, the springs groaning in protest, and sank into the lone chair by the window. Rain traced erratic paths down the glass, blurring the world beyond into smears of shadow and light. Marcus paced the narrow space, his limp more pronounced in the confines, each step a soft thud on the threadbare carpet. "We ride to Vegas with him," Marcus said finally, stopping to lean against the dresser, arms crossed over his chest. His breath came steady, but Jax caught the faint strain, the way his fingers flexed against his biceps, a tell from the sandbox days, when decisions meant life or lead. Jax stared at the floor, the worn patterns swirling like smoke signals, the code pulled at him, that iron thread of loyalty woven through the club since its founding in a Reno garage 2 decades back. No one hurts those we protect, but this wasn't a bar fight or a roadside breakdown. This was a man's life unraveling, a child's future dangling by a thread called Harrison Vale. The name evoked images Jax had pulled from his phone earlier, slick photos of the CEO at galas, arm around politicians, his smile as polished as the boardroom table where jobs vanished like exhaust in the wind. Vale's company, Logitech, had swallowed Tom's firm in a merger, algorithms deciding fates with cold efficiency. Jax's own trucking days had ended similarly. A dispatcher's voice over crackling radio. "Route optimized. Your services no longer required." A knock at the door pulled him from the spiral. Rico entered without waiting, carrying a 6-pack of bottles, non-alcoholic, a concession to the younger riders' sobriety pledges, and a laptop balanced precariously on top. He set it on the rickety table, the screen's glow casting blue shadows across his face as it booted up. "Contacts came through," he murmured, pulling up a grainy video feed from an old army buddy in Chicago. It was security footage, time-stamped 6 months back. Tom in a crowded office, tie askew, pleading with a suit who turned away, Vale unmistakable, his back rigid as he walked into an elevator. The audio was muffled, but the desperation in Tom's slumped shoulders spoke louder than words. Marcus leaned in, breath held, the room's hum of the AC the only sound beneath the storm. Jax felt the moral weight settle heavier, a choice crystallizing in the dim light. Intervene and risk the club's fragile peace with the law, stand back and let the system grind another father into dust. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a bottle, the condensation cold against his palm, mirroring the chill seeping through the window cracks. "We get him to that hearing," Jax said at last, voice gravel rough, the decision landing like rain on parched earth. Quiet, no noise, just eyes on the road. Rico nodded, closing the laptop with a soft click, the finality echoing in the pause that followed. Outside, lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the lot in stark white, thunder rolling like an approaching convoy. Marcus exhaled, the tension easing from his frame just a fraction, and clapped Jax on the shoulder, a brief touch, brotherly, conveying what words couldn't. The Hawks didn't roar into battles, they rode steady, shields against the unseen storms. As the night deepened, the 3 men sat in the half-light, planning routes and contingencies in low murmurs, the rain a relentless backdrop. Jax's thoughts drifted to Ellie, her small hand in Tom's, and further back to his own empty mailbox, letters never sent. Redemption wasn't a grand gesture, it was this, the quiet choice to stand in the gap. Loyalty a balm for old wounds. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, each second a step closer to dawn, when engines would fire again, carrying them toward a confrontation veiled in silence. The desert wind howled beyond the door, carrying whispers of justice that no courtroom could contain. Dawn broke over the motel like a reluctant witness, the rain from the night before, leaving the parking lot puddled and slick, reflecting the pale grey sky in fractured pools. Jax stepped out into the chill, his breath fogging the air as he zipped his leather jacket higher, the zipper's rasp cutting through the quiet. The Ironhawk's bikes stood in a loose semicircle, dew beading on their tanks like unshed tears. Engines silent for now, but humming with promise in his mind. He lit a cigarette, the flame steady despite the damp, and inhaled deeply, the smoke curling upward to mingle with the scent of wet sage and cooling asphalt. Marcus emerged from the room next door, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his limp softened by the morning's haze as he joined Jack's without a word. Rico was already at the van, checking the tires with methodical presses of his boot, water splashing faintly underfoot. He'd driven through the night to scout the route to Vegas, his old truck rumbling back just as the first light crested the horizon. "Road's clear ahead, but the storm's tail is hanging on. Flash floods possible in the washes," he said, voice low and even, wiping his hands on his jeans. No urgency in his tone, just the facts laid out like a map on the hood. Jax nodded, exhaling smoke toward the east, where the highway vanished into a veil of mist. The decision from last night sat heavy in his chest, a stone smoothed by resolve, but unyielding. Getting Tom to that hearing wasn't just a ride. It was threading a needle through the eye of a system that chewed men up and spat out bones. They loaded up quietly, duffels tossed into the van, helmets clipped to handlebars, the Brotherhood moving like shadows in the half-light. No grand speeches, just the subtle shifts. Marcus's jaw set a fraction tighter, Rico's gaze lingering on the shelter's distant outline miles back. Jax crushed his cigarette under his heel, the ember hissing out in a puddle, and fired up his bike. The engine caught with a throaty growl, vibration traveling up his spine, grounding him against the doubt flickering at the edges. What if Vale had reach here, in this forgotten stretch? What if showing up turned a quiet favor into a spotlight the Hawks couldn't afford? But the code whispered louder, protect the vulnerable, even if it meant riding into the unknown. By mid-morning, they pulled into the shelter's lot, the sun breaking through in weak shafts that did little to warm the air. Tom stood by his battered pickup, Ellie bundled in a too-big coat beside him, her fox toy tucked under one arm, Mr. Whiskers in the other. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes deeper than the night before, but there was a flicker of gratitude as he saw the convoy approach. Rita hovered nearby, arms crossed, her expression a mix of relief and worry, the wind tugging at her scarf. "He knows the risks," she murmured to Jax as he dismounted, boots crunching on gravel still damp from the rain. Jax met her eyes, seeing the echo of his own buried fears there, the what-ifs of a life upended. Tom extended a hand, grip firm but trembling slightly, calluses rough from years at a desk now idled. "Didn't expect this," he said, voice barely above the idling engines. Ellie peeked from behind his leg, her gaze darting to the bikes with wide-eyed curiosity tempered by caution. Jax crouched to her level, the leather of his knees creaking. "We're heading your way, kiddo. Room for 2 more if you want the scenic route." She nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through, her fingers tightening on the toys like talismans. Tom hesitated, glancing at the pickup's flat tire, then back to the shelter where his future hung in the balance. "I can't ask—" "You didn't," Marcus interjected from his bike. "Visor up," his tone steady as rebar. Rico backed the van closer, door sliding open with a metallic groan, offering space without fanfare. Tom exhaled, the sound ragged, and helped Ellie into the back, her boots dangling as she settled on a makeshift seat of blankets. The group rolled out in tandem, bikes flanking the van like outriders, the highway unfolding ahead in a straight, unforgiving line. Rain-slicked shoulders gleamed under the tires, and Jax rode point, wind whipping at his vest, carrying the faint brine of distant storms. The tension built mile by mile, subtle at first. A crackle over Rico's radio from a contact in Vegas, warning of Vale's lawyers circling the courthouse like vultures. Tom's voice drifted from the van's open window during a fuel stop, strained as he recounted the merger. One email and it was gone. 20 years building code, and he calls it redundancy. Ellie and I, we were just collateral. Jax listened from his bike, pumping gas under the diner's awning, the pump's click echoing his pulse. Controlled rage simmered low, not a blaze but a banked fire, fueled by memories of his own dismissal, the foreman's curt nod, the empty dispatch office, He handed Tom a bottle of water, their eyes meeting in a shared silence, compassion threading through the anger like oil in an engine. As they crested a rise, the radio spat again. Vale himself was in town, schmoozing donors at a charity luncheon, his presence a shadow over the hearing. Marcus pulled alongside Jax, signaling a slowdown, his face tight under the helmet. Internal conflict gnawed. Push harder, risk a tail, ease off, and let the system claim another. Jax's hands tightened on the grips, leather gloves creaking, breath measured against the rising wind. Ellie's laughter floated back from the van, light and fleeting, a reminder of what hung in the balance. No one hurts those we protect. The desert stretched endless, canyons yawning like open graves. But the convoy pressed on, loyalty a quiet roar beneath the storm's distant rumble. Jax felt the pull sharpen as Vegas lights pricked the horizon, neon bleeding into the dusk like wounds in the sky. Tom's hand rested on Ellie's shoulder in the rearview mirror Rico had angled, a father's anchor in the gathering dark. Compassion won over the rage, steadying Jax's resolve. The choice wasn't vengeance, but presence, a wall against the tide. The engines hummed in unison, carrying them forward, the weight of unspoken guilts lightening just enough to breathe. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Jax Harlan reach more people who still believe in humanity. The Vegas courthouse loomed like a monolith against the bruised evening sky, its marble facade catching the last glints of sunset in cold, unyielding lines. Jax eased his bike to a stop in the shadowed lot, the engine's rumble fading into the hum of distant traffic and the faint patter of residual rain on overheated pavement. He killed the ignition, the sudden quiet pressing in, heavy with the scent of exhaust and cooling metal. The Iron Hawks dismounted in unison, their boots scraping softly on the asphalt, forming a loose perimeter around the van where Tom helped Ellie out, her small hand swallowed in his. Her fox toy dangled from her free arm, fur damp from the day's mist, and she blinked up at the building with wide eyes, the weight of the unknown etching faint lines of worry on her brow. Jax watched from a few paces back, his leather vest creaking as he crossed his arms, the chill seeping through the fabric like an old ache. Marcus flanked him, helmet tucked under one arm, his breath steady but measured, the prosthetic leg shifting subtly against the curb. Rico lingered by the van's door, his broad frame a quiet sentinel, eyes scanning the lot for shadows that weren't there. No words passed between them. The ride from the desert had forged this silence, miles of highway stitching their resolve into something unbreakable. Tom's face, pale under the sodium lamps flickering to life, carried the strain of a man staring down the gavel, eyes hollow, jaw set in that fragile line between hope and fracture. Inside, the corridors echoed with the muffled shuffle of footsteps and the low murmur of voices, air thick with the sterile tang of polished floors and stale coffee from a nearby vending machine. Tom led Ellie by the hand, her steps hesitant on the echoing tile, while Jax and the others followed at a respectful distance, not intruding but present, like the steady thrum of engines on an open road. The courtroom was a sparse chamber, wooden benches worn smooth by countless pleas, the judge's bench elevated like a judgment seat under harsh fluorescence. Harrison Vale sat in the front row, his suit impeccable, a tablet glowing in his lap, the architect of Tom's downfall, now positioned as a character witness for the ex-wife, his presence a calculated blade. The hearing unfolded in measured beats. Tom's ex, sharp-featured and composed, detailing instability in clipped tones, her gaze sliding past Ellie as if she were an afterthought. Tom spoke next, voice low and steady, recounting the merger's fallout, the overnight evaporation of security, the drift west with his daughter as his only compass. His hand trembled on the witness stand, not from fear but from the raw edge of truth, the words hanging in the air like exhaust in still dawn. Ellie sat beside Rita, who had driven in separately, her small fingers twisting the fox's tail, breath coming in soft, uneven pulls. Jack stood at the back, arms folded, feeling the moral suspense coil tighter, the choice to speak or stay silent, to let law carve its path or let loyalty carve another. Then Vale rose, his voice smooth as oiled chrome, painting Tom as unreliable, a risk to the child he'd once provided for. But as he spoke, his eyes flicked to the rear of the room, landing on the cluster of leather-clad figures, Jax's scarred knuckles, Marcus's steady gaze, Rico's unyielding posture. No threats, no raised voices, just the quiet weight of men who had ridden through storms for this moment. Ellie's head turned slightly, catching Jax's eye across the space, and she offered a tiny wave. The fox lifting with her hand. It was that gesture, innocent, uncalculated, that pierced the room's tension, a ripple through the judge's pause, through Vale's polished delivery. The CEO faltered, his tablet forgotten in his lap, words trailing into a hush. Jack saw it then, the crack in the facade. Vale's glance lingering on Ellie, then on Tom, reframing the man not as a statistic, but as a father, clutching remnants of a life Vale's empire had shattered. Perhaps it was the girl's tear-streaked resilience, or the silent brotherhood arrayed like guardians, but Vale's posture shifted, shoulders easing as if a weight he'd carried unexamined settled differently. He sat without finishing, the room holding its breath in the strained silence that followed, broken only by the judge's gavel calling recess. In the hallway after, Tom pulled Jax aside, his grip firm on Jax's arm, eyes glistening under the corridor's dim lights. "You didn't have to," he murmured, voice cracking like dry earth under rain. Jax shook his head, the lines around his eyes deepening in the half-shadow. "We all ride with ghosts," he said softly, the words carrying the echo of his own hidden past, the daughter he'd failed, now a young woman whose silence mirrored his regrets. Tom nodded, understanding blooming in the pause. A second chance forged, not in confrontation but in presence. Ellie hugged Jax's leg then, her small arms tight, breath warm against his jeans, and he knelt, hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the tremble in his fingers betraying the flood of compassion beneath the strength. The judge reconvened briefly, granting temporary custody to Tom with conditions, job search aid from the shelter, counseling funded by a quiet Hawks donation. Vale slipped out without a word, his silence a concession louder than any admission, the corporate armor dented by the humanity he'd glimpsed. Outside, as night cloaked the city in neon haze, the group gathered by the bikes, engines firing in low growls that vibrated through the cooling air. Tom and Ellie climbed into the van, heading back to the shelter's fragile stability, while Jax rode tail, the wind carrying the scent of rain-washed asphalt and unspoken forgiveness. In the quiet miles that followed, loyalty proved stronger than any law, a thread weaving outcasts into something enduring. Jax glanced in his mirror at the van's taillights, fading but steady, and felt the weight lift just enough. The road ahead not empty, but shared. Under the vast desert stars, engines whispered of survival, where second chances bloomed in the silence between heartbeats. Like headlights piercing the endless dark. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching The Case of Santa Noticed the Single Dad's Daughter Crying. What he did made the CEO go silent. See you in the next one.